All right, let's get right into it. The book of Joshua, wow. It's got to be one of the most action-packed, dramatic, and honestly deeply controversial books in the entire Hebrew Bible. We're talking war, miracles, the founding of a nation, it's all in there. But, and this is a big but, it's also a text that forces us to ask some really tough questions about history, about faith, and about violence.
You know, even if you've never actually opened the book itself, I bet you've heard this phrase. It's from the most famous scene, right? The miraculous fall of Jericho. It's just such a powerful image, and it really sets the stage perfectly for what this book is all about. A story where divine intervention and military conquest are completely intertwined.
So, to really get a handle on this, we're going to break it down into 4 parts. First up, we'll look at the story of the conquest itself, just as the Bible tells it. Then, we'll dig into the origins of the text. Who wrote it and when. After that, we'll pit the narrative against what modern archaeology has to say. And finally, we'll tackle the big one, the battle over what it all means.
All right, first up, the story of conquest. Let's start with the narrative just as it's written. The book of Joshua picks up right where Deuteronomy leaves off, which is, well, it's a huge moment in Israel's history.
So, imagine this. Moses, the legendary leader, is gone. And now it's all on his successor, Joshua, to finish the job. God gives him a direct order, basically, lead the people across the Jordan River. It's time to take the land I promised to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all those centuries ago. So right from chapter 1, the theme is crystal clear. This is all about God finally making good on a very, very old promise.
The way the book lays it out, this whole conquest is like a lightning-fast, perfectly executed military campaign. It's broken down into 3 main waves. First, they hit the center of Canaan. This is where you get the famous, miraculous wins at Jericho and Ai. Then, the army swings south. And get this, a clever treaty with a group called the Gibeonites, and some pretty incredible divine help. I mean, the sun literally stands still in the sky. That seals the deal there. And finally, Joshua pushes north to take down a massive alliance of kings, wrapping it all up with the capture of the huge city of Hazor.
And this really puts the scale of the victory into perspective, at least according to the book. Chapter 12 isn't really a story at all. It's more like a list, almost like a general's report after a war, just ticking off the wins. It tallies up every single king they defeated. You've got 31 kings west of the Jordan under Joshua, plus the 2 that Moses' forces dealt with on the east. The message here is unmistakable. This was a quick, decisive, total victory. And then you get that final satisfying line, the land had rest from war.
Okay, so that's the story as the book tells it. But that naturally leads us to our next big question. Where did this story even come from? Who wrote this thing? And maybe more importantly, when?
Well, it turns out there are 2 very different answers to that. On one side, you have the traditional view. This is what you'll find in early Jewish texts like the Talmud, and it says Joshua himself wrote it, with maybe just a few lines added later about his death. But the modern scholarly consensus points in a completely different direction. Most scholars today don't see Joshua as a standalone book at all. Instead, they see it as the kickoff to a much bigger, connected saga called the Deuteronomistic history. Think of it as a collection of books from Deuteronomy all the way through Kings that were likely written or edited by the same group of people with a really consistent style and a shared theological message.
And this timeline really highlights the key issue here. The actual events in Joshua are supposed to have happened way back in the late Bronze Age, right? Somewhere around 1400 or 1250 BC. But, and this is huge, scholars think the book was actually written down much, much later. An early version probably came together during the time of King Josiah. That's in the 600s BC. And the final version we have today was likely finished up after the Babylonian exile, post-586 BC. So just do the math. We're talking about a gap of at least 600 years, maybe more, between when these things supposedly happened and when the story was finalized. That's a massive gap in time.
So that huge time gap, that brings us to what is probably the most controversial part of this whole discussion. This is where we get the big clash between the biblical story and the archaeological record. The big question is, does the evidence we dig up from the ground actually support the story of a massive, swift invasion?
Okay, let's just take the 2 most famous battles, Jericho and Ai. The Bible gives us this vivid picture of Jericho's walls collapsing and both cities being totally destroyed. But here's the thing. For decades now, the overwhelming archaeological consensus has been that neither of these places were even occupied, let alone major fortified cities, during the period the conquest is set.
To put it really simply, archaeology suggests there were no walls at Jericho to fall down at that time.
And it's really important to get this. This isn't just a problem with one or two cities. The broader scholarly view is that there's no direct archaeological evidence for a single unified military conquest of Canaan, like the one described in the book. Now there are exceptions. Hazor, up in the north, is a big one. It does show evidence of a violent destruction around the right time. But that's a rare case. The overall picture just doesn't line up. Instead, most scholars think the origins of Israel were something totally different, more like a slow, gradual settlement, or maybe even an emergence from people already living within Canaan.
And this quote from the biblical scholar John J. Collins really just says it all, doesn't it? He says, "There's little that we can salvage from Joshua's stories of the rapid, wholesale destruction of Canaanite cities and the annihilation of the local population. It simply did not happen." I mean, that's about as blunt as it gets. From a modern historical perspective, the conclusion is pretty stark.
Okay, so if the conquest didn't happen the way the book says it did, that forces us into a whole new kind of question. And this brings us to our final and maybe the most important section. If it's not literal history, what is it? Why was this story written in the first place?
So yeah, that's the big question, right? If it's not a factual report, what is the point of this story? This is where the whole conversation shifts. If we stop trying to read Joshua like a modern history textbook and instead ask, what did this story mean to the people who first wrote and read it, then a whole new world of meaning starts to open up.
And there are basically two main ways to look at this, and they really get to the heart of the debate. First, you can read it as a theological narrative. From this angle, it's a powerful story about God's faithfulness, right? It's about God finally fulfilling that ancient promise to Israel's ancestors. But then there's another way to see it, more from a historical perspective. This view sees it as a kind of national origin story, basically propaganda, written way later by the Kingdom of Judah to back up its own territorial claims and create this epic, unifying backstory for itself.
Now look, we can't possibly talk about the meaning of Joshua without talking about the really tough part, the violence. At the very center of this conquest story is this concept called harem. That's the Hebrew word for the divine ban. And what it means is a command from God to completely destroy an enemy. We're talking people, property, everything, as an offering to him. And yeah, this is the command that makes the book so incredibly difficult and ethically challenging for pretty much any modern reader. But here's the thing, despite all the historical questions and the really serious ethical problems, it's the theological themes in Joshua that have kept it so central to both Judaism and Christianity for thousands of years. It's a foundational story about the Promised Land being a divine gift. It's about obedience being the absolute key to success. It's about Joshua being the perfect leader, a model of faith. And maybe above all, it's about a God who, no matter what, keeps his promises.
And that significance takes on a really unique twist in Christian thought, which brings us to the number 2. Because for Christians, there are really two Joshuas. You've got the first one, the military leader we've been talking about. But here's a cool linguistic fact. The name Joshua in Hebrew is Yehoshua. When that got translated into Greek, the language of the New Testament, it became Iesus, which we pronounce as Jesus. So for Christians, the first Joshua, who brings his people into a physical promised land, is seen as a powerful foreshadowing of the second Joshua, Jesus, who they believe brings all people into an eternal, spiritual rest.
So when you take a step back, what you're left with is a book of powerful and kind of difficult dualities. On the one hand, it's this foundational story of divine promise and faithfulness. On the other hand, it's a deeply troubling account of brutal violence that raises some of the toughest ethical questions you can imagine.
And that really leaves us with the big final question. And it's not just for scholars. I mean, this story has been used throughout history to justify all sorts of conquest and colonization. But at the same time, it has been a source of incredible faith and hope for millions. So the real challenge for us as modern readers is to wrestle with all of it, the good, the bad, and the very, very ugly. How should an ancient story of conquest, faith, and violence be read today? Yeah, that's a question with no easy answer at all.